Hi, welcome to the February 3rd meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, where we talk about best practices and just making things work when you're running any form of conformant Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. On the agenda today, I added a coverage of recent updates to software, which includes both the VMware infrastructure products like vSphere, as well as the open source Kubernetes components like the cloud provider and the CSI storage plugin. We had an informal chat before the meeting started, and I think Miles will go on the agenda in a bit and talk about possibly amending our recurring meeting time for maybe better convenience to the people who tend to attend. And I also noticed recently that there were a number of conversations scattered about Slack, not all in the user group channel, but some of them were in the cloud provider channel. I think some might have been in the Tanzu Community Edition, but all related to mapping Kubernetes zone features to running on things like vSphere clusters. So maybe if we get time, we can chat about that if people are interested. I put in the chat the link to the agenda notes document, and I'm going to share my screen just so I can share my thoughts as I go over that. So just a minute as I try to get the share running. Okay, I assume you can see that agenda notes document. And somebody, okay. So recent updates, both ESXi and vCenter were recently updated, recent meaning January 27. The links are there in the document. This addresses some of those things that caused at least some of these components to have had bugs sufficient that they were recalled from being available on download, but new improved versions are there and available and strongly recommended. On the Log4j subject that we talked about in the last meeting, VMware did conclude an investigation and found that at least couple aspects of this weren't exploitable in VMware products, but the authoritative links are there. And there are a lot of VMware products, but this one is pretty much just talking about the infrastructure related to Kubernetes. Those links go the full span, so go look over there if you're interested. The CSI storage plugin was updated in mid-January. There were features added for those still running on vSphere 6.7, and go look at that link to go get it and read about it. I believe there were also features related to supporting upgrades from the old in-tree storage plugin to the CSI version. There were a number of doc updates on the storage plugin, and in particular, these are doc updates that specifically relate to you if you're not using the vSphere with Tanzu commercial product. If you're using upstream open source or other vendors' distros, I think what you might find there would be perhaps new information or things that are better documented now than they were before. The documentation related to CSI with zoning also had a recent update, and I went there and took a look, and it looked like pretty useful stuff. Bug fixes if you're on CSI 2.3. For the cloud provider, the Helm chart version 1 was released, and there are docs over there on how to use it. cloud provider itself had an update that related to being able to configure IP subnets a little better. I know the person who asked for this feature in particular was using KubeVip and had asked for some enhancements related to being able to use it a little more flexibly. So that might be of interest to people. The alpha of version 1.23 was released in mid-January. This principally would be useful if you want to move up to the newer version of Kubernetes. At the cloud provider meeting yesterday, the dev announced that they expect this release by February 11. As usual, that's just an estimate. It could come in a little earlier, it could be later because things might happen, but just wanted to let you know what's going on. Then Miles, if you want to bring up the subject of new meeting time, you can go for it. I'll stop my screen share.
Sure. So whenever we originally formed the user group, Kubernetes VMware User Group, maybe a year and a half ago or so now, maybe a year, I don't really remember. We had a poll on what time slot to hold it in. At the time, a lot of the folks that were coming to the user group regularly were based in West Coast and US, and the vote came out to be, I think it's 11 a.m. Pacific, right, Steve?
That's correct.
Okay, so in the last while, it appears to be more and more predominantly EMEA-based folks. So maybe it makes sense for us to have another poll with some alternate time slots and see how that comes out, just for the folks that are regular attenders that are based outside of the US. If it doesn't change, that's fine. But I figure it's worth having another poll because it's been some time now since we asked.
That sounds good to me. I'd second it and maybe suggest that you probably better add a few more selections, but we might as well ask the people on the call now for their suggested times. I don't think you want it free form, so maybe just have an assortment out there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do people prefer like during work hours, EMEA time, or like morning time, early afternoon, or after work is usually the best?
I like this time slot already.
Okay, fair enough.
I also, while I am in Israel, I do prefer this later time because it doesn't work for me during my work schedule. It works for me at night. So
Sure, no problem.
What was the time you'd prefer, Miles? So curious.
A little earlier than 7 p.m.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not precious about it. If it works for everyone else, that's cool. I'm okay with it.
Yeah, well, why don't you add whatever your preferences are and we'll just see what happens. And of course,
Sure.
It's kind of unfair. You know, we're not going to do it verbally in this meeting because the people who can't make this time probably aren't here. So we'll just
I'll throw it into this.
there.
I'll put it in the Slack then.
Okay. Then let me see if anybody tacked on anything else in the agenda. No, that was it. We do have an opportunity in this user group to submit a maintainer track talk for KubeCon, and that will be due in around a week or so, I think. And I was thinking of putting together a proposal for a talk on using the event notification system built around Knative that William Lamb and Michael Gash talked about in a user group meeting about 9 months ago, because it seemed to draw a lot of interest. And I know that additional activity has taken place there, but I'm open for other ideas if people have them on things they might like to see at the KubeCon event. We could maybe have the event system and add a second thing or just go with that, but just putting it on the table for discussion. Okay, I'll just mark that down as no objections and no other ideas, so we'll probably go forward with that. And I've talked to Michael, and he seemed amenable to attending physically to give a presentation on that subject. So that sounded pretty good to me too. For those who weren't aware, that the conference is slated to be physical in Spain in mid-May. The
It was
other
gonna be in
subject,
Spain. I just
yeah,
assumed it was going to be Netherlands again.
no, it was Valencia.
That would be
Oh.
nice. It'd make discussions here a bit easier if it was in Amsterdam.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. I'd like to go, kind of, but things are still a bit wacky around COVID,
Yeah. Same here.
and it's hard to justify going there at the moment within ITQ. So
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, you
I'll-
never
I'll
know
be
what's going to
going.
happen. It seems to change on a week by week basis. Where I live, you could even like alter your view of the world by news source and get a completely different impression of what's going on in your own city.
Much so, especially in the US.
No,
We've
I'll
got-
be going, and hopefully my CFP will be accepted as well, but I'll be going for sure as long as COVID allows that.
Yeah.
what talk were you planning to give, Scott? What were you hoping for?
I'm doing one with someone from the TCE team on Carvel packaging.
How surprising.
Exactly.
And then the other thing that I didn't put it in the agenda, but like I said, I don't know if the rest of you noticed it, but there've been a fair number of questions recently. Some of them might be by newbies, but people trying to run Kubernetes on top of vSphere in light of and taking into account clusters, even moving things around. It seems to be sort of a recurring issue. And it seems to vary quite a bit. I mean, some of these people have been enabled by recent open source releases, so that I think that I looking at the descriptions of the questions they're asking, I'm almost thinking they're more on home lab like environments rather than production grade commercial, but still we'd like to support all of these, because particularly when you go out to edge locations, the fact is, even in enterprises, sometimes these edge locations end up looking closer to a home lab than a big data center. So I think some of these issues are pretty generic to a lot of people. And I gathered that some of these people even had situations where they're on, they have multiple ESXis, but they don't even potentially have shared storage readily available with them, which, I mean, my own attitude is, as long as you're not on persistent workloads running on Kubernetes, it probably is just fine to not have any shared storage. If you need to support a persistent workload like a database or something, there might be hope if you're for hosting that on Kubernetes. If you use the right type of storage solution and maybe had 3 available physical nodes, but going down to 2, I'm not so sure that you're not better off just running those persistent workloads in a VM with vSphere features to attempt to achieve availability, rather than adding a Kubernetes layer on top of that mix. But just one person's opinion, and I know, Miles, you're kind of more authoritative in the storage arena than I am, but
Yeah. When it comes to edge, it gets really hairy, especially whenever you're talking 3 hosts or less, because you have no room for any maintenance whatsoever. So this is actually what Robert and Scott and I were talking about. Maybe doing some work on, or doing some kind of presentation on at some point to do with like ISIs, storage, Kubernetes, how they work or don't work more critically together. Why not to stretch storage and yeah, basically just why not to do things rather than why to do things. But yeah, whenever it comes to K8s on vSphere, the simpler, the better.
I think we could do a whole session just on storage, easily. So the
I have done lots of them.
yeah,
You could do multiple sessions just on storage. It could be a series just on storage. Yeah.
it's so maybe nice for you to know, Steve. The and anyone who's watching, will probably me, Scott, Miles, and some other guy from ITQ that's also thinking about some of these problems. Probably going to do a Tanzu Tuesday session where we continue that conversation about how to kind of make these two worlds match up when it comes to resource and storage use. Thinking of resource use in particular, it's funny because I speak to a lot of guys from infra backgrounds, and their concern always, and it's not Kubernetes related per se, it's that whenever other people are running high workload, high resource use things in their ESX clusters, they get a bit worried. They don't like the black boxiness of a whole bunch of VMs pulling a huge amount of resource X. And there's this strange contention around responsibility, or a feeling of responsibility. I've yet to meet a vSphere kind of admin or a team responsible for vSphere that was happy leaving an ESX cluster, just letting it go and saying, well, apparently today it's running at 90% RAM. We don't care. We're not responsible. Whatever's running it, it's the problem of the people running it. Even if there are very well delineated agreements about who's responsible for what.
So when you say just letting it run, like they just ignore any ability to impose resource constraints and just see what happens, and they do it by design?
Because vSphere admins for 15 years have been trained to not let that happen.
Yeah.
And to take responsibility and to make sure that vSphere stays healthy, ESX stays healthy, all the stuff running on it stays healthy. And of course, partly they have to, because if the cluster is going to go 100% CPU, vSAN's going to fall over, NSX is going to fall over, all these things are going to fall over. So you have to cap it somewhere.
That's why there is a best practice in terms of, like, in general, the community is basically aligned on like a 4-to-1 ratio of, overcommitment in resources in many cases, in standard use cases. And in Kubernetes, like a 1.5-to-1, maybe 2-to-1, but never more than that, because you don't have the control in vSphere. And just because of how workloads are actually managed by Kubescheduler, is that you just don't go over a 2.1 ever in your ratio of vCPU to CPU and RAM to RAM. And then you're usually fine in those cases, but that's also a waste of resources, right? You don't get the 4-to-1.
So these recommendations, where are you getting these from? Because I've never come across anything like that in vSphere documentation.
A white paper that was put up on OpenShift mentioned this, and there was one on PKS in 1.0 of PKS that hasn't been updated since 1.0, but like best practices of running on vSphere. And then just from overall like community, like talking with people and seeing what organizations are doing and things like that. But there's nothing official out there that says this, because no one wants to come out and say, yeah, get half the resource utilization out of your environment, only do 2-to-1 ratio. Doesn't sound good. But when it's written down, when you explain it, it makes sense in terms of how the scheduler works, and that you actually have over provisioning in Kubernetes with requests and limits if you set them correctly and things like that. But it's the double level of over provisioning that's always wrong.
I almost wonder that any organization that would kind of run kind of loose on vSphere, that Venn diagram probably overlaps with people who aren't using the resource limits things in Kubernetes too, but that's just speculation.
Exactly. For sure. No, but it's the same issue that we had with like data stores that are thin provision, where like you provision your disk as thin provision. and your NetApp is thin provision volumes. It's like, great job. You have no idea how much is actually used or how much is allocated or what's going to happen tomorrow. It's this double level of management has always been an issue, and it's been known that it's an issue in storage and there's best practices. Kubernetes, it's just not official that there are best practices on this, but it's the exact same issue. Here it's compute, there it's storage, but it's the same idea. Over provision at one level, don't over provision at 2 levels that don't have any communication with one another to tell you or to understand and correlate what is going on.
I think there seems to be an element of have your cake and eat it too from people that manage a VI infrastructure that happens to have cakes on it as well, though, which is they want to get the absolute maximum efficiency out of the platform. So that means when stuff is running steady state, they're running 80% CPU utilization, RAM utilization, it all hums along nicely, but you've got absolutely no room for burst or, workloads rolling out. Like if you suddenly, nuke a cluster and then you run Argo CD and you set up the entire stack all over again, it's going to have a bad time doing that. So yeah, there's definitely an element of people want to be too heavy on the resource consolidation just because that's how you've always done it. And it was real easy because it was steady state before.
Yeah, the other thing that could put you over the edge is, of course, a failure, and it could even be a software failure, not necessarily hardware. But I've heard horror stories of people running cluster-aware persistent apps like Cassandra, Mongo that go across clusters, and you can host those on Kubernetes. But if they ever trigger themselves to think they need a rebuild or a node replacement, those things can get pretty ugly. Often evidence, this hasn't come up yet, but networking is another aspect that traditionally on the vSphere platform, you could earmark and carve out resource allocations in your, allocating the physical network bandwidth to particular workloads or particular designated traffic like storage versus whatever compute you're hosting. And it was always viewed as pretty wise not to have a big burst in compute take out your underlying storage, because that could lead to a positive feedback loop. And I think that layering Kubernetes with these cluster aware persistent apps can do that exact same thing. Some of those things on a rebuild can really get ugly, like demanding 10, 20x the normal baseline amount of network connectivity should they start trying to rebuild a node from scratch.
I also think there's something new here, because I mean the effect that whatever VMs are doing can kill your clusters. We've known this for a while. The thing is, the chance of many VMs all doing something at the same time, there are only a bunch of scenarios where that can happen. Either you're already running some kind of distributed workload,
exchange tags or something,
or you're having some kind of reboot storm, or the virus scanner went crazy on 1,000 Horizon VMs at the same time, or you get some kind of failure which causes a massive HA storm. We've seen that before. So, or DRS storms, all kinds of stuff. But Kubernetes, I've never seen. Kubernetes is this amazing control plane to run any kind of distributed architecture on top of, and the chance of getting these kind of effects are so much larger with this just during normal operations, because the whole thing is a distributed model, and everything you do with it has that aspect to it. If I'm going to do a blue-green update of some application architecture, I'm going to hit so many VMs at the same time because of the nature of the distributed architecture. And that's a sea change, I think, when it comes to how resources are utilized on the layer and right underneath it.
I think there might be an element as well of, I have paid for these features in these vSphere licenses. I am going to use every single feature because I paid for it. And that includes DRS and fully automated DRS in particular, which, if anything, is a hindrance to running Kubernetes on top of vSphere, because unless you do some intelligent work with affinity groups and hosts and VM affinity groups, it makes it really, really difficult to have a deterministic topology all the time. And there's a lot of the stuff that, if it were me that was running Kubernetes in prod, I would just turn them off on vSphere and try and make the vSphere layer simply run my VMs, leave them alone, let them sit in place, and let Kubernetes do everything else, because you're going to have two control planes fighting with each other the entire time otherwise.
Yeah, it's a conclusion I've reached very slowly, over the last 2 years. Still quite new to this stuff, and this is just with TKGI. But it's the same. You reach the same conclusion. Just start turning stuff off because you don't need it. It gets in the way. But there's another aspect to this, and I saw a tweet come around just, I think it was earlier this week, which was very interesting. Which I think I retweeted it. It was you can simplify the infrastructure layer and then do Kubernetes, bunch of clusters, and then you leave the intelligence to that control plane, and hopefully to the developers deploying apps, if they are intelligently deploying apps and building apps. And there was this great tweet. It was like the top 5 things that most Kubernetes developers are still not doing properly, like basic stuff. Give, like a pod, a limit.
Liveness checks.
On its resources.
Yeah.
Start basic things like this.
Don't set the limit to 10 times the requests.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people. Oh,
Yeah.
what? No, so yeah, my request is 1 gigabyte. My limit is 100 gigabytes. Your machine has 20 gigabytes. Yeah, but I'm setting the limit to 100. What does it matter? It matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm active in the Kubernetes IoT Edge working group, and I have to say that my observation there is that people who grow up in a massively elastic public cloud, it's almost like the platform isn't actually going to coach you on putting these constraints there. They just as soon you sprawl out and gobble down a bunch of extra VMs and run up your bill. People who evolve using Kubernetes in that environment and then in later years try to move to Edge with having gotten away with never declaring any resource allocations or limits, are in for a pretty bad year of learning in a hard way why that stuff is important. And I think that some of these same lessons apply. I think when you potentially move to vSphere and you're paying for your own hosting and kind of have a finite amount of capital, you want to invest in your compute resource and not have it be open-ended. I mean, once you go on-prem, it isn't a public cloud where it's just a matter of worrying about it when the bill comes a month later. You can just always be guaranteed you get what you want more or less instantly. And
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that you could remedy with like an admission controller inside Kubernetes that requires you to have, limits and requests set on all pods that get deployed. I mean, there's a pretty simple solution.
Oh yeah.
I set that up for a customer where I actually did the best thing because we wanted them to set it. We just said, great. If you didn't set it, we didn't want to deny the request. All we did was limited their pods to 10 megabytes and 1 millicore. Nothing started. They're like, what? What's wrong with the system? I said, nothing. Watch. And I bring up an Nginx pod. I set requests and limits and everything is great. They say, well, why is that? I said, well, you're not setting requests and limits. They don't know there's a validating webhook in the back end that's doing this. All they see is their pod and it's getting 10 megabytes and 1 millicore.
so what's the next step though
learn.
on the chessboard of looking ahead 2 or 3 moves when they all lie and say they need 1,000? Well, I guess if they said they need 1,000 cores, they never get scheduled, right? But
we have a validating webhook as well you can build that says if they've set it above a certain number, it's not allowed. And like things like Kyverno, for example, or OPA can do the same. You can have a config map in like Cube System, let's say, with exclusions. So if someone were to have a specific workload that needs more than what a normal workload should need, they talk to the platform team who would add that into the exclusion list, allowing them a certain amount. But otherwise, for a standard workload, you want self-service deployed to the cluster, awesome. You're limited to whatever is decided in that organization based off the types of apps they need. What's the max CPU and memory that should be set and what the ratio of requests and limits should be. And all this can be done with JMS path in Kyverno or in Rego if you so feel the need to learn another language that makes no sense in OPA.
I never heard
But,
of this Kyverno. Could you maybe drop a link or spell it for me so I can look it up later?
Kyverno. It's the easiest policy manager for Kubernetes by far because it's all YAML based. So you don't need to know a programming language. And the real benefit is that it also has it has both the validating webhooks like OPA has. OPA just added mutating webhooks so it can mutate requests as well. But Kyverno also has what's called the generate policies that allow anytime, let's say, a namespace is created, automatically create these other objects.
Oh, so image pull secrets and stuff like that too.
That's what I use. And they actually have a way where you can generate an object or you can create a clone of an object from another namespace and it will keep them synced. So that's what I do for image pull secrets. I have an image pull secret in Kube system. Any new namespace that gets created, it creates it in that namespace. And then it automatically syncs it. So if I need to change that password, I just change it in the Kube system namespace and it gets replicated within 2 minutes to all other namespaces.
It's nice. At the minute, I'm using a custom controller to do that. That has its own CRD. You update the CRD and then it updates the objects. It's a bit of a hack, to be honest. That seems like a nicer solution.
Secret gen or something else, or a custom controller?
No, it's Alex Ellis's reg creds controller. That one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, Kyverno replaced about 9 different controllers that I used to have.
Have you looked at pulling back the resource available from a host? So each host obviously exposes how much CPU and RAM it has. Could you build an admission webhook then based off of as long as the total number of workloads?
Sorry, you cut out there for a second on my side. What was that?
Sorry. So essentially, could you total up the number of resources from each of the nodes in the cluster and then have an admission controller, an admission webhook that then says, as long as the resource that's being requested by this pod is less than what's left in the cluster, admit the workload?
You should be able to do that with JMS paths in Kyverno as well, because it has an API access to any Kubernetes object that you can pull in and then use that and save that in variables and use it in next steps and things like that. So you could do that, would be my guess. I've never done anything like that, but you probably could.
And if it got rejected, what would your idea be, Miles, to sort of try to emit an alarm notice or something?
Well, no, I mean, if it's an admission webhook, then I guess you could have it fail, or you could get it to default, like what Scott was saying, to some ludicrously low value. So it admits it, but then it won't start up, and then they'll have to go debug why it won't start up. So either of those would be okay as far as
it just strikes me that it's a situation where it's based on things not having to do with this particular workload, what was already there before I tried to run. So it wouldn't be repeatable or deterministic, and without leaving some breadcrumbs to explain what this happened and when, somebody might be clueless as to the behavior going on.
Right. So what the validating webhook does is you can set it into warn mode or fail mode. And then it will, in either case, even in warn mode, it will print out to the console of the user what the error that you're throwing in the policy is. So this policy failed, pod created if it was in warn. If it wasn't and it was in failed mode, it would just throw that error and wouldn't create the object. So that's the benefit of doing it through a admission controller. Doing it through mutating can be very beneficial in terms of the user experience, but it's less visible to the developer what's actually happening. So it's kind of a way of don't make your developer do things because you just mutate it with sane defaults. on the other hand, you know, it is kind of behind the scenes and they don't know the magic that's happening. But that's actually one of the guys, someone who used to come a lot to these meetings, Chip Zoller from Dell. He's actually one of the maintainers of Kyverno and has been doing amazing work on all of the policies out there. There's, I think, over 100 policies, example policies on their website for everything, and like really good use cases as well. And they're active. They have an active channel on the Kubernetes Slack as well.
You know, I'm just brainstorming here. This isn't really an admission controller, but my thoughts are that looking ahead, people might have a tendency to exaggerate their resource demands. And as a policy, you might want to police that. And it's a sort of a situation where you have to let them run, but leave a reminder that, hey, in 5 minutes or an hour, I'm going to check on this and just compare kind of what they declared they were going to use to what the historical actual usage is to go catch liars. And this might be a great basis for something that I think would be really popular. You know, the whole green movement is popular of eliminating waste. And if you were to couch this as something that would support a greener planet by reducing wasted resource like over provisioning compute and power usage to more match, you know, I don't know, a target 80% loading of what you spent money on, this could catch on. And I'm wondering what tools might be available to build something like that out by putting together existing projects.
You could do that with Prometheus, I would imagine. So not the modification part, but you could pull back the metrics for a given pod, say over, I don't know, a week, and then just say, we'll take the 90th percentile or 95th percentile, and we'll just modify all the objects to be 95th percentile for their resource quotas.
You're right. So then if you had out of
issue,
band
though.
Prometheus keeping a record of this workload or this, you know, you could even do it by container saying, you know, based on history, this is the range within X standard deviations of what this thing actually utilizes. Then this, you know, when this thing gets rescheduled, you could look at what the declaration is and compare it to its actual track record. And if there's a massive discrepancy, that could issue a warning or, you know, some kind of a mutation to.
You could have Alert Manager do it. You don't even need to modify the Kube API objects directly. You could just have an Alert Manager rule set up that evaluates those criteria and just bugs the person that deployed it and just say, you're being greedy, stop.
I think
Scott,
the one issue,
what was the issue? Yeah.
The one issue is it's the same issue that we have with like tools that try to monitor the traffic of an application, then generate network policies off of it. Things like what VRNI and Network Insight can do on like VMs. It doesn't work well in Kubernetes from my experience because the average lifetime of a container in Kubernetes is so low and the tag changes and they made a small change to the code that anything like this really needs a learning period. It needs to do inference and it can't do that. It can't infer anything in the amount of time because by the time it's collected enough data, it's irrelevant because you're already 4 versions ahead in the container in terms of production, right? So it works well possibly at the beginning or people that are just starting with Kubernetes and that may be still on the same release cycle of 2-3 times a year. But the people that are really moving into the cloud native world in organizations that are doing that and doing rapid iterations on their deployments, it just never has enough time to learn to get accurate values.
Do you think it could work at the deployment level then, Scott? Because, you know, that spins up a new replica set each time, but the deployment itself would be a consistent identifier at least.
So it's a consistent identifier. The issue is what do you do then between versions? Because versions of applications, all of a sudden, you change the version of Go from 1.16 to 1.17. CAP controller just did this and it lowered by like 20% their memory usage just by updating the Go version, right? Because that was actually something wrong in the Golang version they were using. But like, any of these things are so specific that you could have a version that all of a sudden jumps up or goes down all of a sudden because they brought in some new library. It just becomes very difficult. It's not that it's impossible. It's just the numbers you get here are not nearly as accurate as things like VROps is or VRNI are for like compute and networking in the traditional monolithic world. It's just it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of how, we've kind of moved along in this world where things are just so short-lived.
I suppose your historical database could just have enough information collected so that you collect version numbers and things like that and throw it out if
right.
Your data's been invalidated. Maybe also throw out anything that is so short-lived that it doesn't matter. But
right.
It would be great if you could
AI
catch
model.
even things
you need
like
a really good AI model.
Yeah.
If you had a good AI model that Miles built that would like basically correlate, it understood the versions of a deployment and then understood what the standard deviation is between each of those versions of going up and down between versions of the container being used, it's possible that it could predict what the general like number of versions that you create are and what the standard deviation changes are between each of those versions, and then accordingly build it.
I'm just thinking, Scott, from what you said, that
your audio caught up.
a problem, like say you're running a Python app and someone just does traditional Python library management, import TensorFlow, all of it, just give me everything. And, suddenly it's 500-600 meg heavier in RAM usage for that one little container. I think it would catch outliers, which might be useful, if there's anomalies, but it's definitely going to libraries to things.
Yeah, I think, it's not just things like your example of drawing in too much through the Python TensorFlow, but man, if you could flag things like container images that came off Docker Hub that got corrupted, there's been a sad history of Bitcoin miners managing to slip things into databases and things. And if you had this kind of monitoring going on, you should be able to catch those anomalies where, yeah, the version went up, but gee, it's sure peculiar that when the version bump happened, it's burning twice as much resource for for some reason. And maybe you don't shut it down, but if you had a system to report those things as warnings or notifications, that might be really useful, not just for greenness and preventing resource waste, but maybe catching things like security risks that are, I don't know, ransomware would be another thing maybe you could flag by this.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of tools that do that actually really well with like sandboxing and things like that. Different proprietary tools out there. Whether it's VMware's Carbon Black for containers or things like Aqua Security, Prisma. There's really good tools that do that, like runtime protection. I think that the one interesting thing also that Kyverno does is that it has, they just added, I don't think 1.6 has come out yet. I think it's still in the release candidate phase. But when it comes out, they added image signing, validating webhooks to make sure that things are signed with like a co-signed certificate, to make sure that things actually that no one intervened in the middle. And that's something that's big with like Docker Hub. If you're using public registries, sign your images and make sure that they are actually the same when it comes down, because that's usually where a lot of these people are getting in. They're not getting into the image necessarily. They're faking the image on the way and doing things through, different manipulations along its way into your cluster. And so
secure supply chains are all the rage these days, I hear.
Oh, really? I wonder why.
It's not because I just started working on it.
No, everyone's been talking about it. SigStore did a great job of pushing that out there, and everyone else did. And yeah, it's great to see it finally happening, though, that things are finally starting to come out to handle a secure supply chain.
Okay, well, I think we kicked around a whole bunch of ideas here related to this, this that maybe could spawn off future activity. If what you were talking about of doing this whole storage thing is something you need an extra person on, I just think it would be a learning experience for me. So if you need an extra body in there, or even want to run by a draft of a presentation or something, let me know. And also in terms of a forum to present it, it could be at these user group meetings or something else. I don't know what you had in mind there, or even, you know, that this is almost such a broad concept that it could be a whole series of presentations, blogs, whatever, I think, and could go in user group meetings, physical conferences, online conferences, or whatever.
Yeah, that's why we were looking at the what we are doing Tanzu Tuesday, March sometime, isn't it, Robert? March 22nd or something.
Yeah. But it's actually, it's more just to talk about it and see if we can structure our thoughts on the matter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would like to structure it in some way into the form of maybe, you know, a talk or something, and just take a part of it, like the storage thing. But yeah, it's a huge subject. I find it personally a little bit overwhelming, all of the aspects of it.
It's one of those things that you would give to O'Reilly and there would be 3 co-authors on it type thing. It's massive.
But I think there's a huge need for this kind of guidance to be out there, because everyone's struggling with this.
Yeah, and having it go public, you could provoke discussions that would maybe add even more ideas to the table and things that people hadn't thought of. So yeah, I'm in favor of getting it out there. So let me know if I can be a part of it. Okay, does anybody, we've still got 10 minutes left. If anybody has any other things for the agenda, otherwise we can end this early. So
I have a question that maybe you guys can help me with. It's related to the CSI. So, so I'm still quite unfamiliar with how you do things like metric collection in Kubernetes, and how you can scrape things with Prometheus. And one thing I noticed recently was that the CSI apparently now exposes a load balancer service.
Yes.
So you, with a Prometheus, what's the word for it?
Instance or service monitor.
Yeah, well, a thing that produces Prometheus stuff.
An endpoint.
Oh, I think it's that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I thought just today, I think I saw like this was popping up in other places as well. Now, up until now, the various Kubernetes distributions that I've seen, which are obviously VMware ones, they don't do this yet. But now TKGS does, because it incorporates a version of the CSI that does this now. The problem is it's not documented anywhere at all, except in the CSI project. And it's kind of weird because do Kubernetes and there's this load balance entry and it doesn't even work by default. So I'm like, what is it? What can you do with this? So that's kind of my question. Like, what's it actually for? How are you supposed to use endpoints like that? Why are they now switching to service type load balancer? How did it work previously? I mean, if I roll out a TCE cluster today, that same pod is there, but it's cluster IP. It's not a load balancer. So what's changed that this is now being exposed externally? Why are they doing this?
So it doesn't need to be service type load balancer, but it is service type load balancer in TKGS because the thought is that people want to run external Prometheus instances somewhere else on the network and it would not be in that cluster because where you're seeing service type load balancer is in supervisor or in TKGS, and you generally not have your Prometheus instance installed there. So it can't be cluster IP, and there's no point making it node port. So it's service type load balancer. What it is essentially key value pairs, right? That's how Prometheus does its metrics collection. It's a fetch-based system. It runs every 15 seconds by default. At Prometheus instance, that is, and it will search whatever endpoints it is given. Now you can give it endpoints in a number of ways via CRD with a type of service monitor, and you give it essentially the service name, the namespace it's in, and it'll go scrape that. It'll discover and scrape that endpoint, right? And what is exposed from CSI is just, like GC underscore memory underscore alloc equals, and then the number, right? That's kind of the level of stuff that you're getting. There might be number of PVCs and the amount of storage use. I don't know. I haven't looked at what metrics are in there. But it's just, plain text, and then it gets scraped every 15 seconds by Prometheus. So you would have to set up a service monitor or either a static target, and this is what Prometheus calls them, is targets. So you're setting up a target to scrape. And depending on how you install Prometheus, you could do that through the UI, you can do it through K8s itself, because there's API objects to do that, or use their operator. In any case, you set up a target that says, I want you to scrape this IP at this port, at this path, and the default path is /metrics. So if you go to /metrics, you'll see all of it. And that will just pull those back, and they will then be stored in Prometheus, and you can run queries on them over time. That's essentially it. It's quite simple, but getting into the Prometheus stuff and figuring out how to get like new targets into it is a bit mind-bending to begin with, especially if you've never played with it before. Like I did the ML demo, I think here at one point, where it was like recording the number of frames per second that were being processed by the GPUs. And it is very non-trivial to get that kind of stuff set up if you've never worked with it before. But the things that you need to care about are service monitors, targets, and the default path is /metrics. So if you hit that IP on /metrics, you should be able to see it.
And the only other thing that is very important is that if you're using the Tanzu Prometheus, just because whether it's Tanzu Community Edition or commercial, have fun. It's in a config map. So you have to edit a manual config map and add it in the Prometheus method. You can't use a service monitor. That's part of Prometheus operator, which is the de facto way that most people are installing it today. In the community, because it gives you the ability to set up alert rules for alert manager and service monitors and scrape jobs and things like that all through CRDs. So I would suggest going down that approach no matter what, because it's very hard to manage through a config map. Even if you know Prometheus, it is not trivial, and have fun reloading the pod every time.
All right, you're gonna have to have a config map based reloader for the pods and all kinds of stuff. So just use the Prometheus operator if you're interested. And if you're gonna stand it up, I would suggest the easiest way to do that is use the Helm chart called Kube Prometheus Stack. That is absolutely the one to get started with.
And it comes with like 100 dashboards built in, and is absolutely awesome.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. Kube Prometheus Stack is great, and there's a few of them that are great out there. That's good. There's also the Bitnami one isn't bad for Prometheus operator because it includes Thanos, which Kube Prometheus operator does not. So if you need large scale or long-term saving of data.
Which one includes Thanos, Scott?
It includes the Thanos sidecar.
No. Which one?
The Bitnami Prometheus operator.
Okay.
Because I just had that actually by a customer who needed to keep their metrics for a year and a half.
Jesus.
Why? Regulations. I said, there's no, it's not logging. They said, yeah, metrics need to be kept for a year and a half. Never understood why. But yeah. So they use that one because that way they can get Thanos in there easily.
And Robert, yeah, that is the right Helm chart. And I just sent you my values file for that config map, or that Helm chart that I use live. So it is run on my ARM cluster. So there's some image customizations, just whip all those out, but use the rest as a reference.
Cool. Okay, thanks. That's good advice.
Do you own blah.cloud?
I do. Blah.cloud is my blog and my home domain and everything like that. Yeah.
That's a great domain.
Yeah, I got in there real early whenever they made those TLDs available.
Yeah. I got one in right after that also because I started my days in VRA. So I just did vrabbi.cloud, and that's my domain
Nice.
for everything.
Yeah, same here. I've gone through about 4 or 5 domains over the years. I think I'm just going to keep this one going though, because it's nice and apathetic, and that's kind of where I'm at.
Very nice.
You're muted, Steve.
So we're at noon Pacific time. So last chance if somebody has a very short topic. Otherwise, let's close this one and resume in a month. Okay, well, bye, everybody. It was a great conversation as usual, and we'll look forward to the next one.
See you later.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Cool.
Bye, everyone.